The renewal notice came through on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail that shouldn't matter but does, because Tuesday is the day I run the dormancy queue. I have run the dormancy queue every Tuesday for 6 years. I know what is supposed to be in it. The Kesselmar Colonial Administration Office occupies the 14th floor of a building in Geneva that was designed in the 1990s to look permanent and ended up looking tired instead. My desk is positioned near the window not because anyone thought I deserved a view, but because the interior desks are used for the junior analysts, and I have been here long enough that junior is no longer a word that applies to me. My title is Senior Licensing Compliance Officer, Class 2. What that means practically is that I manage the administrative life cycle of colonial charters, their issuance, their renewal cycles, their dormancy classifications, and their termination. I am the person who decides on paper whether a colonial enterprise is legally alive or legally dead. Most of what I do is routine. The romance went out of it years ago, if there ever was any. Charters come in, charters expire, populations file continuance reports, resource extraction operations submit quarterly yield attestations, and I process them. I flag anomalies. I escalate genuine irregularities to the Oversight Division. In 6 years I have escalated 11 cases. 4 of those were clerical errors. 3 were fraud. 2 were jurisdictional disputes that got resolved at a level above me before I finished writing the referral. 1 was a legitimate crisis that ended in a planetary evacuation and a termination of charter. I had to countersign myself. That one I don't think about much anymore. Or I try not to. The dormancy queue on the Tuesday in question had 43 items. That is a normal number. The queue lists all colonial charters in suspended or partially suspended status, operations that have filed for voluntary dormancy, operations awaiting population census confirmation, operations in administrative review, and operations flagged for extinction review pending final termination. I process each one in sequence. I confirm status, log any incoming activity, and either maintain current classification or move the charter to the next procedural stage. Charter 7 Meridian 09 was item 31. I recognized the designation. Meridian 09 was a generation-class settlement on a mid-tier orbital body in the Outer Provision Zone, one of the wave of colonial charters issued in the early expansion period, when the administrative frameworks were looser and the population projections were optimistic in ways that later proved embarrassing. The settlement had been declared extinct 14 months ago following the failure of its life support infrastructure and the confirmed death of its entire registered population. I had processed the extinction declaration myself. I remembered it because the population count had been small, 41 residents, and because the charter termination had come through with unusual speed, which at the time I had attributed to the lack of surviving claimants to contest it. Extinct charters do not appear in the dormancy queue. There is no procedural reason for them to be there. A terminated charter has no administrative life cycle left to manage. It sits in the archive, it gets indexed, and it stays there. It does not generate renewal notices. It does not appear in active queues. I stared at the entry for a moment. The renewal notice was timestamped 4 days earlier. It listed Charter 7 Meridian 09 as the subject. It cited subsection 14 copyright of the Colonial Continuance Framework, which is the provision that allows a dormant charter to be renewed by a qualifying successor entity if renewal is filed within the statutory window. The statutory window for a standard dormancy classification is 18 months. The notice had been filed within 18 months of the extinction declaration. The problem, of course, was that an extinction declaration is not a dormancy classification. They are different instruments. They have different codes. They produce different administrative outcomes, and they exist in different sections of the registry. The system should not have accepted a 14 copyright renewal filing against an extinct charter. The system should have rejected it at intake. I pulled up the intake log for the filing. The log showed that the renewal notice had been submitted through the standard continuance portal, using a valid applicant account, and that the system had processed it without error. The intake validation had not flagged the classification mismatch. The charter status field in the renewal application listed the subject charter as dormant pending review rather than extinct terminated, and because the field had been populated with a plausible status code, the automated validation had passed it through. Someone had submitted the renewal using the wrong status code, either through error or through knowledge of which status code the system would accept. I did not jump to the second interpretation. In my experience, administrative errors outnumber deliberate manipulation significantly, and the appropriate response to a misclassified filing is to flag it, correct the record, and notify the applicant of the error. I logged my observation, drafted a standard correction notice, and then paused before sending it because I realized I had not looked at the applicant account. The applicant account was registered to a corporate entity called Vethra Provision Services, Limited. I ran a standard registry check on the entity. It was a legitimate incorporation, registered in a mid-tier administrative jurisdiction, 2 years old, no prior charter activity, no listed principals beyond a registered agent address that resolved to a services firm that provides registered agent services to several hundred corporate entities across the zone. Clean. Anonymous. Structurally unremarkable in the way that entities specifically designed to be unremarkable tend to be. I sent the correction notice. I noted the case in my daily log. I moved to item 32. The correction notice bounced back the following morning with a response I did not expect. The response came from a human, not an automated system. The sender was listed as a compliance liaison at Vethra Provision Services, and the message was brief and professionally worded. It acknowledged the classification discrepancy. It stated that the applicant was aware of Charter 7 Meridian 09's listed status as extinct terminated, and it argued, citing case law I had not previously encountered, that the extinction declaration itself was procedurally defective and therefore void, which meant the charter's operative status reverted to its pre-extinction classification. which had been dormant pending review. I read the message twice. Then I pulled the case law citations. They were real. The citations referenced 3 prior administrative tribunal decisions, all from the Outer Provision Zone jurisdiction, all dealing with contested extinction declarations. The legal argument was narrow but not frivolous. If an extinction declaration was filed without independent population verification, if it relied solely on infrastructure failure data rather than confirmed biological census, then it could be challenged as procedurally incomplete. The argument had succeeded in 2 of the 3 cited cases. I pulled the original extinction declaration for Meridian 09. The population verification field listed a single data source, infrastructure telemetry from the colony's life support monitoring system. There was no independent census. There was no biological confirmation. There was no external audit. The declaration had been processed on the basis of the life support system's final transmission, which had reported total system failure, and the administrative determination had been that total life support failure in an enclosed colonial environment was sufficient evidence of population extinction. That determination had been made by me. I sat with that for a moment. I had processed 41 people as legally dead on the basis of a machine's last report. I had not required independent verification because the infrastructure failure had been catastrophic and the colony was remote and there were no surviving claimants to contest the declaration, so there had been nothing to prompt me to ask harder questions. I had followed procedure. The procedure, as written, permitted what I had done. I checked the date of the extinction declaration again. 14 months ago. The statutory challenge window for a contested extinction declaration was 16 months. Vethra had filed their renewal with 11 weeks to spare. I escalated the case to the Oversight Division that afternoon. I wrote a clear factual referral, the renewal filing, the legal challenge argument, the procedural gap in the original extinction declaration, and my assessment that the matter required review at a level above my authority. I flagged it as a priority case. I noted the 14-month timeline and the statutory challenge window. The Oversight Division acknowledged receipt the same day. The acknowledgement was automated. I did not hear anything further for 9 days. On the 9th day, I received a response from Oversight that was 2 sentences long. It confirmed that the case had been reviewed. It stated that the original extinction declaration for Charter 7 Meridian 09 had been upheld and that the renewal filing had been denied on procedural grounds. It did not explain which procedural grounds. It did not address the legal challenge argument. It did not mention the population verification gap. I drafted a follow-up requesting clarification on the legal challenge disposition. The response came back within the hour. The matter was closed, the determination was final, and further inquiries should be directed to the Outer Provision Zone Administrative Tribunal if the applicant wished to pursue an appeal. I looked at the response for a long time. In 6 years I had escalated 11 cases. I knew how Oversight communicated. They were slow and thorough, and their responses were always longer than necessary because they were written by people who understood that documentation was protection. 2 sentences was not how oversight closed a case with live legal challenge arguments in it. 2 sentences was how someone closed a case they did not want documented. I did not write that down anywhere. I noted the case as closed per oversight direction. I returned the charter to the archive. What I did, instead of writing it down, was run a quiet registry search on Vethra Provision Services that evening, using tools I had legitimate access to but would not normally deploy on a closed case. I was not sure what I was looking for. I told myself I was satisfying professional curiosity. I had always been a better liar to other people than to myself, so I knew that was not entirely true, but I let it stand. The registry search returned the standard corporate record. But the corporate record had a field I had not looked at closely before, the listed operational scope. Most holding entities in the provision services sector list their operational scope in generic terms: resource logistics, supply chain management, that sort of thing. Vethra's listed scope was more specific. It read, Legacy Asset Recovery and Repatriation Services, with particular expertise in closed colonial designations. Legacy Asset Recovery. Closed colonial designations. Those were words that meant something specific in the administrative vocabulary of colonial law. A legacy asset was a tangible or intangible resource associated with a terminated colonial operation. Physical infrastructure, resource extraction rights, territorial claims, intellectual property derived from colonial activity. Recovery and repatriation meant the process of reasserting those assets into active commercial or administrative circulation after colonial operation had ended. Vethra was, apparently, in the business of finding value in dead colonies. That was legal. That was a recognized commercial activity. There were firms that did nothing else, and some of them were quite large. The administrative framework had always contemplated that terminated colonial operations would leave residual assets, and it had created mechanisms for those assets to be legally recovered and reapplied. But those mechanisms operated through the Asset Recovery Registry, not through charter renewal. You did not renew a dead colony's charter to recover its assets. You filed an asset recovery claim. The 2 processes were entirely separate. Charter renewal was about continuing or restarting the colonial operation itself, the population, the governance, the operational license. Asset recovery was about the stuff the colony left behind. If Vethra wanted Meridian 09's assets, they had filed in entirely the wrong place. Unless what they wanted was not the assets. Unless what they wanted was the charter. I spent the better part of the next 2 weeks doing something I had no formal authorization to do, which was a quiet, careful, off-cue review of every charter renewal filing that had been submitted against a closed or extinct colonial designation in the past 4 years. I did it slowly, in small increments, using my standard access credentials and working within the normal parameters of my job, so that nothing I did would appear anomalous in the system logs. I was aware that I was being careful in a way that implied I believed I was being watched, and I was aware that believing you're being watched is not the same as being watched. But I was also aware that in 6 years of this job I had developed reasonably good instincts about when something was structurally wrong, and my instincts were loud. I found 9 cases. 9 charter renewal filings against closed or extinct colonial designations, filed over a 4-year period, in 4 different administrative jurisdictions within the Outer Provision Zone. Each filing used a slightly different procedural argument to challenge the original closure or extinction determination. Each filing was submitted through a different corporate entity. Each corporate entity was, on investigation, registered through the same registered agent services firm that had registered Vethra Provision Services. 7 of the 9 had been denied. 2 had succeeded. I pulled the records of the 2 successful renewals. The first was Charter 3 Callaway 14, a small agricultural settlement declared dormant 8 years ago after its primary water reclamation system failed and the population was evacuated. The charter had been renewed 3 years ago by a holding company called Structural Continuance Partners. The renewed charter listed an operational status of active reduced, with a population count of 12. There was a continuance report on file from 18 months ago. The continuance report was a single page, signed by an individual listed as the site administrator, containing standard yield attestation figures and a population health summary that read in its entirety, "All residents present and operational. All residents present and operational. Not well. Not healthy. Operational." I looked at the population health summary field in 50 other continuance reports to see if that phrasing was standard. It was not. The standard language was variations on "all residents confirmed present and in good health." Operational was not a word that appeared in any other report I could find. The second successful renewal was Charter 6 Vanthos 22, a resource extraction operation declared extinct 6 years ago following what the original record described as a complete population displacement event, a phrase I had not previously encountered in colonial administrative records and which had no definition in the standard terminology framework. The renewal had been filed 2 years ago by a company called Meridian Continuance Group. Meridian. The same word as in Charter 7 Meridian 09. I did not know if that was a coincidence. The word meridian was not uncommon, but I noted it. Charter 6 Vanthos 22's renewed operational record showed an active status with a population count of 9. Its most recent continuance report had been filed 8 months ago and was similarly sparse. The population health summary read, "Unit cohesion maintained, performance within acceptable parameters." Unit cohesion. Performance parameters. These were not the words of a settlement population. These were the words of a managed workforce. I want to be careful here about what I say next, because I have spent considerable time since these events trying to distinguish between what I observed and what I concluded, and the distinction matters. What I observed was a pattern of charter renewal filings against closed colonial designations, 2 successful renewals, and continuation reports using language inconsistent with standard population documentation. What I concluded, what I began in those weeks to believe, was something that I could not then prove and cannot now fully substantiate, but which has not left me. My wife, Daria, had been a colonial demographer. She had worked for the Outer Provision Zone Population Registry for 11 years, tracking population movements across the zone's colonial network, migration patterns, census methodology, population stress indicators. She was good at her work in the way that some people are good at things they care about deeply, which is different from the way people are good at things they have merely practiced. She cared about the numbers because she understood that the numbers were people, and that when the numbers were wrong, the wrongness had a human address. She had died 2 years ago. A travel accident, unrelated to her work. I do not need to describe it further than that. What is relevant is that in the months before her death she had been agitated about something in her work, not in a way she had fully articulated to me, because she was careful about what she shared regarding active cases, but in a way I had registered and not pressed her on because we had been in a difficult period and I had not wanted to add professional stress to personal tension. She had mentioned once that she thought there were populations in the zone's registry that did not match what she was seeing in the field data. She had used the phrase ghost populations. I had not asked what she meant. I had assumed it was a statistical term of art. Sitting at my desk, reading continuance reports that described human beings as units with performance parameters, I thought about the phrase ghost populations and understood for the first time that she might not have been using it as a term of art. I understood something else too, which was that the case I was building, quietly, unofficially, with no authorization and no institutional support, was not going to be resolved by filing another escalation to oversight. Oversight had closed a case with live legal arguments in 2 sentences. Whatever was on the other side of this was not going to be visible from the inside of the system I worked in. What I had access to, that most people in my position did not, was Daria's archived work files. She had kept meticulous records. After her death, I had transferred her professional archive to my personal storage with the intention of eventually reviewing it for anything that needed to be returned to her employer, a task I had never completed, because completing it would have meant spending extended time in her files, and I had not been ready for that. I had not been ready for 2 years. I was ready now, or something close enough to ready that the distinction no longer seemed to justify delay. Her files were organized in a way that reflected how she thought, not by date or by project designation, but by what she called problem clusters, which were groupings of cases that shared an underlying anomaly. She had 17 problem clusters in her active working directory at the time of her death. I went through them methodically, over 4 evenings, looking for anything related to the designations I had found. I found Callaway, 14 in cluster 11. The cluster was labeled in her notation system as RPM discrepancy, which I eventually decoded as registered population versus measured a comparison between the population figures in the official colonial registry and the population figures she was deriving from field data, resource consumption patterns, communications traffic volume, waste output metrics, the kinds of indirect measurement tools that population demographers use when direct census is unavailable. The cluster contains 16 colonial designations. For each one, she had documented a registered population that was significantly lower than what her indirect measurement suggested. Not higher. Lower. The official records said fewer people than the data implied were actually there. I read that several times. In colonial administration, the concern is usually inflated population figures, operations claiming more residents than they have in order to qualify for higher resource allocations. An official registry showing fewer people than the indirect data suggested meant the opposite. There were people on these colonial operations who were not being counted. People whose presence was being deliberately omitted from the official population record. Callaway 14th's entry in Cluster 11 showed a registered population of 0. It had been in a declared dormant status at the time Daria was working on this, and an estimated measured population, based on the indirect metrics, of between 15 and 30 individuals. Between 15 and 30 people. On a colony officially listed as empty. I sat in my apartment for a long time after I read that. The city outside was doing the things cities do at night, indifferent and continuous, and I thought about 41 people on a failed colony whose life support system had sent a final transmission, and about the word operational, and about the phrase ghost populations, and about 2 sentences from oversight closing a case that should have taken 2 months. The rational next step was to take what I had to the administrative tribunal, which is the body with actual investigative authority over oversight's decisions. I had documentation. I had Daria's files. I had a coherent argument connecting the charter renewal pattern to the population discrepancy data to the irregular continuation reports. The tribunal existed precisely for situations where internal oversight had failed. I knew the process. I had drafted tribunal referrals before. I did not file the referral. I did not file it because of something I found in Cluster 11 on the 5th evening, in a subfolder Daria had labeled Correspondence Retained, which contained emails she had considered significant enough to save outside the standard work archive. There were 12 emails. 6 of them were routine interdepartmental communications about methodology. 2 were from an external researcher she had been consulting. The remaining 4 were from a single sender whose address I did not recognize, a personal account, not an official domain, and they were dated in the 3 weeks before her death. I want to be precise about what these emails said and did not say, because I have read them many times and I am aware that grief can create meaning where there is pattern without meaning. The first email asked whether she had shared her Cluster 11 analysis with anyone else at her office. The second asked the same question more urgently. The third said, in full, "Please confirm you have not submitted a formal report." The fourth was a single line, "If you have filed anything, you need to retract it before Thursday." Her death had occurred on a Wednesday. I did not know what to do with that. I still do not know what to do with that. There is no version of it that is comfortable. The comfortable version, that it was coincidence, that she had been in contact with a worried source who happened to have sent a message the day before an unrelated accident, required me to believe in a coincidence of timing and subject matter that my professional experience told me was unlikely. The uncomfortable version required me to believe something that I had no direct evidence for, and that, if I tried to assert it, would be dismissed immediately as the paranoid grief of a widower looking for a conspiracy to explain a random tragedy. The emails had no identifying information beyond the sender address. I could not trace the account with the tools available to me. I did not know who had sent them. What I knew was that whoever had sent them had been aware of Daria's Cluster 11 analysis, had been concerned about whether it had been reported, and had wanted her to retract any formal filing before a specific date. I did not find any record of a formal report in her files. I did not know whether she had filed one anyway, under a separate system, or whether she had decided not to, or whether she had been in the process of deciding when she died. I made a decision at this point that I want to describe accurately because I think accuracy matters, and because I have spent the time since then trying to determine whether it was the right decision or simply the decision I could live with, and I am not certain those are the same thing. I did not file the tribunal referral. I did not go to the tribunal because the tribunal was part of the administrative system, and the administrative system had already demonstrated, in the two-sentence oversight response and in the successful charter renewals and in whatever had happened to the formal report Daria may or may not have filed, that it was not a reliable surface for this kind of documentation to land on. Filing with the tribunal would create a record. Creating a record would create visibility. And visibility, in this specific case, had a prior outcome that I could not stop thinking about. What I did instead was compile everything I had, my own analysis, the 9 charter renewal cases, the 2 successful renewals, the irregular continuation reports, the Cluster 11 data from Daria's files, the emails, and I sent it to 2 places. The first was a journalist who covered colonial administration and who had, in prior years, published documented accounts of administrative fraud in the Outer Provision Zone. I had no relationship with this person. I found them through their published work and sent the material through an anonymous channel. The second was an external researcher whose address I found in Daria's consultation emails, on the theory that this was someone Daria had trusted enough to work with and who might have enough independent standing to do something with the material. Then I waited. The journalist published nothing. I do not know whether they received the material, reviewed it, and concluded it was insufficient, or whether they received it and were advised not to publish, or whether it never reached them. I have no way to know. The researcher responded. Not immediately. It was 3 weeks before I heard anything, but they responded. The response was brief. It said, "I know about this. I have been trying to find someone inside the system who could see it. Please do not send further documentation through digital channels." That was all. I did not hear from them again. 3 months after I compiled and sent the material, I received a communication from the administrative office of the Outer Provision Zone informing me that my position was being reclassified as part of a licensing framework consolidation, and that the dormancy queue function I had managed for 6 years would be absorbed into a centralized automated processing system. My role was being restructured to focus on new charter issuance, which did not include dormancy management, continuation reporting review, or extinction declarations. The communication described the restructuring in positive terms: increased efficiency, reduced administrative burden, better resource allocation. It was signed by a deputy director whose name I did not recognize. I was being removed from the part of the system where I had found this. That was the moment at which I understood, fully and without the last remaining shelter of professional uncertainty, that the system knew I had found it. Not through anything dramatic. Not through a confrontation or a threat. Through a restructuring, which is the administrative equivalent of a door being quietly closed and locked from the other side. I accepted the restructuring. I transitioned to the new role. I now process new charter issuance applications, which is clean and procedural and involves no dormancy queues and no continuation reports and no extinct designations with renewal filings against them. My performance reviews have been satisfactory. I have not been contacted by the journalist, the researcher, or anyone else in connection with the material I sent. I have not received any indication that anything I did had any effect on anything. Charter 7 Meridian 09 remains archived as extinct terminated. I checked it once, after the restructuring. The record is unchanged. Vethra Provision Services renewal filing appears in the record as denied. The case is closed. Charter 3 Callaway 14 remains active reduced, with a population of 12, last confirmed via a continuation report that describes its residents as present and operational. Charter 6 Vanthos 22 remains active with a population of 9, last confirmed via a continuation report that describes its unit cohesion as maintained. I do not know who those people are. I do not know how they came to be on colonial operations that were officially classified as empty. I do not know whether the word operational is being used by someone who does not know what standard language sounds like, or by someone who knows exactly what standard language sounds like and has chosen something different because accuracy matters to them in ways I cannot fully interpret from this distance. I do not know whether Daria found out what I found out, and more, and whether the emails in her correspondence retained folder mean what the most frightened part of me believes they mean. I think about the 41 people on Meridian 09 sometimes. Their colony's life support system failed. The system sent a final transmission reporting total failure. I processed that transmission as evidence of extinction and filed the declaration. The declaration was filed within the statutory challenge window. Vethra Provision Services filed a renewal before the window closed. I don't know what that means. I have gone back and forth on it more times than I can count. It could mean that Vethra was simply opportunistic, that they identified a procedurally defective extinction declaration and attempted to exploit the challenge window for asset recovery purposes, and that there was nothing more to it than that. It could mean that someone had prior knowledge that the extinction declaration was defective, that someone knew the population had not been independently verified and knew the challenge window would be open. It could mean something that I approach and then step back from, because it requires me to believe that a life support failure report can be generated by a life support system that has not actually failed, and I do not have the technical expertise to know whether that is possible, only that the people on the other side of these charters appear to have expertise I do not. I go to work. I process new charter applications. The applications are from developers and extraction companies and population groups seeking to establish new colonial operations, and they are reviewed against a standard framework that I apply consistently and professionally. The applications are clean. They are forward-facing. They involve people who are, as far as I can determine, alive and voluntary and documented. I am good at my job. I have always been good at my job. I was good at it when my job involved the dormancy queue, and I am good at it now that my job does not. The difference is that when I was good at it before, I believed that being good at it meant something, that the work I did with precision and care was connected in some reliable way to actual outcomes for actual people. I no longer believe that with the confidence I once had. I believe it provisionally. I believe it the way you believe in the structural integrity of a floor after you have seen what is underneath one. And what is extinct? You trust those designations not because you have independently verified them, but because the system is what verification means in the context of your work. You do not have a parallel reality to check against. You have the registry, and the registry is the truth until it isn't. I processed 41 people as legally dead because a machine said the systems that kept them alive had failed. That was the registry. That was the truth I had access to. Somewhere in the outer provision zone, 12 people are described in official records as present and operational. 9 more are described as maintaining unit cohesion within acceptable performance parameters. I do not know their names. The continuation reports do not list individual names. They list population counts and aggregate health summaries and operational metrics. The people in those reports are numbers in a system that I can no longer access, managed by an oversight structure that closed my escalation in 2 sentences, administered through a charter framework that someone understood well enough to navigate when they needed a colony's legal existence to be other than what it was listed as. The system continues. The charters are active. The reports are filed on schedule. I approved the framework that processes those reports once before the restructuring. My name is on the approval log. Not on the reports themselves. I never touched the specific content, but on the procedural framework that accepted them as compliant. I checked the boxes. I confirmed the filing format was correct. I did not know at that time that the language inside the boxes was wrong. I know now. That knowledge does not give me a door. It does not give me a lever. It gives me a specific and permanent awareness of what I was part of, held at the precise distance that makes it impossible to fully assign or fully absolve. I was a component. Components are not guilty. Components are also not innocent. Components are functional. I go to work on Tuesdays. I no longer run the dormancy queue. I no longer touch extinct designations or continuation reports or renewal filings. Someone else does that, or no one does, or the automated system does, processing the queue with an efficiency that does not stop to notice when operational means something other than well, when unit cohesion is not a synonym for community. When a charter renewal filed against a dead colony in the final weeks of a statutory window is not an administrative error but a practiced move by someone who understands the system from the inside. From somewhere inside it, possibly, where I cannot see. I think about Daria more than I used to, and differently. I think about the 11 months of her file she spent on Cluster 11, measuring populations that weren't supposed to be there against records that said no one was home. I think about what she might have understood and when, and what she decided to do with it, and what the email on the day before Wednesday was asking her not to do. I think about the phrase ghost populations, and the fact that I now understand it was not a term of art, and the fact that she knew I worked in charter compliance and could have told me and chose not to. I used to interpret that as professional caution. Now I interpret it as protection. She knew what I worked in. She did not want me to see it from the inside. She was trying to keep me outside of it. I did not stay outside of it. I found it anyway through a renewal notice on a Tuesday in the dormancy queue, because that is what happens when you are very careful at a job for a long time. Eventually the thing hiding inside the job becomes visible to you, and then it is visible, and you cannot make it not visible. And what you do with that visibility is the only choice you actually have. I made mine. I sent the material to a journalist who published nothing and a researcher who told me not to use digital channels and then went quiet. I accepted a restructuring that removed me from the relevant work. I did not file with the tribunal. I did not go public. I did not push. I am aware that someone could read that summary and conclude that I did not do enough. I have read it that way myself, at various hours of the night. The counterargument I make to myself is that I do not know what enough would have meant, in this specific case, against this specific system, and that I weighed the prior outcomes available to me and made a judgment. The counterargument does not fully satisfy me. It was not designed to satisfy me. It was designed to let me continue. I continue. The continuation reports are filed on schedule. The populations remain present and operational. The charters are active. The queue runs every Tuesday. I am no longer part of any of it, except in the way that you remain part of the things you touched and did not fix, which is permanent and without administrative remedy, and not the kind of thing that appears in any registry I have ever seen.